File reconstructed by historical researcher, winter of 1898. In the winter of 1898, 38 horsemen rode together into a frozen valley in the northern United States, and none of them were ever seen again. Official records do not use the word mass disappearance. They prefer vague, administrative, almost defensive terms. Prolonged absence, unknown destination, did not return to their properties of origin. But among yellowed letters, debt books, sheriff reports, and fragmented testimonies, the truth remains uncomfortable. 38 men crossed Grey Hollow during a single winter season and simply ceased to exist in the living records. Grey Hollow was not exactly a village. It was a forgotten patch between low hills, dense trees, and a dirt road used by merchants, drovers, and horsemen who transported supplies between small communities. On the 1897 map, it appears only as a fold in the layout, with no name of its own. But in local journals it was called the Grey Valley because of the constant fog that gathered among the trees during the cold months. In the center of this valley, isolated by more than 2 kilometers of narrow, muddy trails, was the property of a woman known only as the widow of Grey Hollow. Her full name appears in different forms in documents, sometimes as Eleanor, sometimes as Eleanor, sometimes just as Mrs. H., which already indicates the kind of irregular oblivion that surrounded her. She had been a widow for over a decade, with no known children, living alone in an old dark wood house with a low barn and an ice cellar built partially underground. This cellar, referred to in the records as a frost cellar, was common at the time. It was used to preserve food during the harsh winter. At first glance, nothing made it different. But it is precisely this cellar that appears repeatedly in later accounts, always described with excessive, almost uncomfortable care, as if the scribes knew they were approaching something they preferred not to name. The riders came from different places. Some were grain delivery men, others were hunters. There were 2 brothers from the south, a newlywed man, and a Civil War veteran who made a living doing odd jobs. They did not travel together from the beginning. They entered Grey Hollow in small groups over several weeks, always during the same winter, the harshest on record in the region at that time. The surrounding community was small, quiet, accustomed to long periods of isolation. Snowstorms closed roads for days. Letters took weeks to arrive. The disappearance of an adult man, especially a horseman, did not cause immediate alarm. It was assumed to be a delay, a change of route, temporary shelter. Time there had always been slower, but something in the records begins to repeat itself in a disturbing way. All 38 names appear associated with the same secondary note, last seen near the widow's property. In some cases, the phrase is even more specific, stopped to ask for shelter. In others, there is only a casual mention of the fact that the horse was found loose days later near the valley. No signs of struggle, no load, no owner. The widow of Grey Hollow was not questioned immediately. In the first few months, no one formally accused her of anything. She was seen as a reserved, polite woman who rarely went down to the larger towns. She bought little, spoke even less, always dressed in dark clothes, always alone. Winter progressed. Spring arrived, and none of the 38 men returned. When the names began to accumulate in the church books, when different families started asking the same questions in different offices, when recognized horses appeared without explanation on the edges of the valley, something changed in the tone of the documents. The writing became more cautious, more dry, as if each word were measured so as not to cause panic. It is at this point that the first strange detail appears, small, almost invisible, but decisive. In a county report dated August 1899, there is a phrase crossed out by hand, replaced by a more neutral one. The original phrase, still legible under the thin ink, read, "Last confirmed access to the property's ice cellar." The replacement removes the reference to the cellar, but the trace remains. And it is from this poorly erased line that the case ceases to be just a sequence of absences and begins to turn into a silence too heavy to be ignored. Before the names began to repeat themselves in church books and sheriff's offices, Grey Hollow was just a passing point, a place where no one intended to stay, but where many ended up out of necessity. The winter of 1898 was particularly harsh. The trails froze early, the wind descended the hills like invisible blades, and traveling alone became a risky decision. Still, men continued to enter the valley, driven by deadlines, debts, promises of payment, and the naive confidence that there would always be some shelter ahead. Testimonies collected years later describe a simple and predictable routine. The riders followed the same narrow path, lined with ancient trees, until they reached the lowest part of the valley. There, visibility decreased. The fog was not constant, but it appeared suddenly, like a sheet pulled over the ground. On days like these, the widow's house was one of the few signs of human life. A dark, sturdy building with occasional smoke coming out of the chimney. The widow, according to distant neighbors, rarely refused shelter. She did not offer warm hospitality, but she allowed men to rest, water their horses, and warm their hands for a few minutes. In return, she accepted small coins, help with firewood, or silence. Many described her as fair, others as overly reserved. There were no reports of direct conflicts, arguments, or threats. The riders did not stay long. In general, they stayed long enough to regain their strength and continue their journey. Some left written records, notes in inns, entries in personal diaries, messages sent to their families. In these texts, the widow appears only as a footnote. A lonely but trustworthy woman, a cold but safe house, a strange but necessary place. The most revealing detail emerges in what was not said. None of the men mention the interior of the house in depth. They do not describe furniture, food, or long conversations. It is as if they had all remained only at the edge of that space, near the door, near the fire, near the stable. The contact seemed functional, not human. There is also the behavior of the horses. In at least 12 documented cases, the animals were seen days later wandering near the valley. They were fed, uninjured, but restless. Some spontaneously returned to the trails from whence they came, as if they had been deliberately released. This indicates that their owners arrived alive at a specific point, and then disappeared without visible resistance. The local community began to notice patterns only too late. The first disappearances were treated as delays, then as route changes. Only when men from different regions began to disappear under similar circumstances did the unease take shape. Still, no one spoke of crime. They spoke of bad luck, of a cruel winter, of bad decisions. The widow continued to live as before. She bought salt, flour, and kerosene once a month. She always paid in cash. She didn't ask for help. She didn't receive visitors. The ice cellar remained closed most of the time, as was expected during the season. Officially, nothing connected her to the disappearances. But there is one isolated testimony, collected many years later, that stood out from the rest. A young farm worker claimed to have spent a night on the property, sheltering from the snow. He said that at dawn he heard noises coming from underground. Not screams, not blows, but something he described as restrained movement. When he asked the widow, she replied only that the ice was yielding with the change in temperature. The young man left shortly after. His account was not recorded at the time. It only surfaced decades later, when there was no way to confirm it. Another clue appears in the local business ledgers. During that winter, the widow purchased unusual quantities of coarse salt, lime, and thick canvas. Taken individually, none of this would have attracted attention. But the pattern repeats itself over 3 months, always after the recorded passage of horsemen through the valley. Even so, no formal complaint was made. Grey Hollow was not a place for easy accusations. People depended on each other to survive the winter. To question someone without proof was to risk isolation. Daily life went on. The snow fell. The men entered the valley, and little by little they stopped leaving. When spring finally arrived and the trails began to open up, it was expected that the latecomers would appear. But what emerged were not men, only horses, incomplete stories, and a silence that was increasingly difficult to sustain. It was then that one of the last records before the final disappearance caught the attention of researchers. A note found in a rider's saddlebag, recovered weeks later, which read only a short sentence, written in haste. She asked for help in the basement. No other details, no signature, and no rider to explain what that sentence really meant. The documents dealing with the night of the disappearances never mention a single event. There was no specific date marked in red. No dawn recorded as decisive. What exists is a succession of last times, last passages, last sightings, last records of life, scattered over weeks, all converging on the same silent point in the valley. Researchers who attempted to reconstruct the facts had to abandon the idea of a single moment. The disappearance of the 38 horsemen was a process, slow, cold, methodical, and precisely because of this, almost invisible while it was happening. The nights in Grey Hollow followed a strict pattern that winter. The cold arrived before dark. The wind gathered among the trees, producing a continuous low sound like restrained breathing. The snow did not fall in constant storms, but in thin, successive layers that muffled footprints and erased tracks in a few hours. It was an environment that favored oblivion. The last confirmed reports describe horsemen arriving at the property at dusk. Some asked for shelter, others just wanted water and a place to warm their hands. In at least 8 documented cases, the widow was seen talking to these men at the door, never formally inviting them into the house, but leading them to the side of the property where the ice cellar was located. The cellar was not visible from a distance. The entrance was partially buried, covered by a heavy reinforced wooden door, insulated with straw and compacted earth. During the winter, it was common to open that space at night when the outside temperature helped to keep the interior stable. Nothing there seemed out of the ordinary to a weary traveler. Records suggest that the request always came from the widow. She needed help moving blocks of ice, reorganizing shelves, checking for leaks. It was work that required strength, but it only took a few minutes. For a knight accustomed to physical tasks, there was no reason to refuse. What happened next is not described in any direct document. The silence begins right there, at the point where the men descend the wooden steps and disappear from the door's reach. The sounds of that night were reconstructed from indirect accounts. A distant neighbor mentioned years later that he had heard muffled knocks in the early hours of the morning. Not violent, but rhythmic, spaced out, like wood being adjusted or something heavy being moved slowly. Another spoke of chains being dragged, but this detail was never confirmed by anyone else. There are no records of screams, no residents reported cries for help, no weapons were fired. This is crucial to understanding what may have happened. Everything indicates that the horsemen did not immediately realize the danger. If there had been a struggle, there would have been noise. If there had been panic, someone would have heard it. The most accepted hypothesis among researchers is that of progressive confinement. When closed, the ice cellar became a dark space with limited oxygen, constant temperature, and absolute isolation. Once locked from the outside, the door required coordinated force to open. Alone, a man would have had difficulty. The most disturbing detail emerges when the timelines are crossed. The horsemen did not all disappear on the same night. They entered the cellar on different days, but the widow's consumption records indicate that the space remained closed for long periods, with no recorded reopening. This suggests that some men may have gone down while others were still there. This conclusion does not appear explicitly in any official report. It is inferred from dates, purchases, average temperature, and frequency of use of the basement. It is a cold, mathematical reconstruction, and precisely for this reason, difficult to ignore. On the best documented night, that of a knight identified only as Thomas R., the sequence is almost complete. He was seen leaving the last inn at dusk. His horse was found 3 days later, properly tied up, fed, near the property. In the saddlebag, in addition to the aforementioned note, there were marks of melted ice at the bottom, something unusual, considering the outside temperatures. This indicates that the horse stood still long enough for the snow to melt under its weight, without moving. Thomas was never seen entering the house, only walking alongside the widow toward the basement. After that, nothing. When spring began to break the ice in the valley, some residents claimed to have smelled a strange odor coming from the ground near the property. Not constant, but noticeable on warmer days. The official explanation was the natural decomposition of animals that had died during the winter. No one insisted. The last confirmed access to the ice cellar occurred, according to an indirect record, at the end of February 1899. After that, the door remained sealed. When questioned months later, the widow stated that the space had become unstable and dangerous, and that she did not intend to use it again. This statement appears in a single document, and is never mentioned again. Winter ended. The men did not return, and the cellar remained closed, guarding everything that the records did not have the courage to write down. The climax of the case is not in a discovery, but in an absence. When the authorities finally decided to act, there was no longer enough time, conditions, or consensus to open that door. And so, the exact spot where 38 horsemen disappeared remained untouched, sealed by the cold, by silence, and by a collective decision not to look any closer. When the thaw advanced on Grey Hollow, the valley became passable again, and with that, attention returned. Families began to arrive from outside, some for the first time. Wives, brothers, aging parents came, all bringing names, descriptions, and questions that could no longer be postponed. 38 men had not returned. No bodies had been found. No alternate route had been confirmed. The county sheriff opened a belated investigation, limited from the outset. There was no formal crime reported. There were no direct witnesses. And above all, there was no political pressure to turn the case into something bigger. The region depended on the trade that passed through the valley. Turning Grey Hollow into a place of fear meant economic isolation. Still, some action was taken. Travel records were cross-referenced. Inns provided names. Horseshoes found on the trails were catalogued. It was at this point that the pattern became impossible to ignore. All roads led to the same place, the widow's property. She was called to testify once, in a procedure described as a formal conversation. The record of this meeting is short, almost dry. The widow confirmed that she had offered occasional shelter. She denied having seen many of the men mentioned. She stated that the winter had been harsh and that she was not responsible for the decisions of adult travelers. When asked about the ice cellar, she replied only that it was an old, dangerous structure and that she avoided using it. There was no search warrant. The reason appears in a marginal note made by the county clerk himself. Insufficient grounds for trespassing on private property. The phrase reflects not only a legal limitation, but also the moral climate of the time. Accusing an isolated widow without material evidence was seen as excessive, something that could destroy reputations without offering concrete answers. Some residents quietly disagreed. One farmer claimed to have seen the widow burning large amounts of wood out of season during early spring. Another mentioned recent marks of turned earth near the cellar entrance, shortly after the thaw. These reports were noted, but never thoroughly investigated. There was a lack of resources. There was a lack of will. Instead, there was a kind of tacit agreement. Authorities recommended that travelers avoid Grey Hollow during the winter. Inns began to suggest alternative routes. The valley was not officially closed, just forgotten. The widow continued to live there for a few more years. Records show that her purchases gradually decreased, then they stopped. In 1903, her name appears for the last time in a book of overdue taxes. There is no death certificate. There is no record of a move, just the end of the mentions. Decades later, when researchers revisited the case, they found something even more revealing than any physical trace. Unanswered letters. Wives who wrote for years. Brothers who asked the county for any additional information. All filed away, with no formal response. The institutional silence was as constant as the silence of the valley. The revelation of the case did not come through a confession or a late discovery. It came through the sum of small omissions, through the refusal to open a door at the right moment, through the conscious choice not to turn suspicion into investigation. Historians agree on one essential point. There was sufficient evidence to justify a thorough inspection of the property. The ice cellar should have been opened. It was not. And that decision, made out of fear of making a mistake, of accusing, of facing what might be found, sealed the fate of the case, not only of the horsemen, but of the truth itself. The mystery of Grey Hollow is not sustained by ghosts, but by real people who decided to look the other way. And in doing so, they allowed 38 lives to become nothing more than scattered numbers in dusty files. The last official record of the investigation ends with a brief, almost embarrassed sentence. Case closed for lack of new evidence. But the basement remained there, closed, waiting. Decades have passed since the winter of 1898, and Grey Hollow no longer exists as a recognizable place. The trails have been absorbed into larger roads. The oldest trees have fallen. The valley, once avoided, has become just an indistinct fold in the rural landscape. Yet in the archives it remains intact, preserved not by what was said, but by what was never fully written. Historians who returned to this case in the early 20th century found fragmented material. There was no organized dossier, no conclusive inquiry. Instead, there were small, scattered traces, account books, letters never sent, marginal notes made by weary civil servants. Reconstructing what happened required accepting an uncomfortable truth that the disappearance of the 38 horsemen was not an unsolvable mystery, but an avoided problem. The widow of Grey Hollow was never tried. Her name, real or not, was lost in variations of spelling and administrative indifference. There is no death certificate associated with her. It is not known where she died. She disappeared in the same way as the men, silently, without a final record, dissolved by time. The ice cellar was also never officially opened, not for lack of opportunity but by choice. With each generation, someone decided it wasn't worth disturbing something so old, so inconvenient. The land was leveled. The underground structure probably collapsed on its own with the cycles of freezing and thawing. What was inside became part of the soil, indistinguishable from any other forgotten human trace. In more recent books, the case is cited only as a statistical anomaly, a winter with an unusual number of absences, an outlier in a harsh season. No direct mention of the property, no lines dedicated to the basement. The story has been softened to fit into graphs, but when you read the original documents carefully, something resists. A pattern, a method, a succession of small decisions, asking for help, trusting, not investigating, postponing. None of them monstrous in isolation, all of them together, definitive. Grey Hollow was not the scene of overt violence or recorded screams. It was a place where silence was enough, where the cold worked in tandem with human hesitation, where the absence of urgency allowed the irretrievable to become permanent. Today, in revisiting this case, we are no longer looking for culprits. We are looking for understanding, not to justify, but to remember. Because stories like this do not survive because of their immediate impact, but because of the way they reveal the discrete flaws of a society, those that leave no visible marks, only empty spaces. 38 horsemen entered Grey Hollow that winter. None left a grave. None had a farewell. What remained were scattered names and a basement that no one wanted to open. And perhaps that is what makes this case so difficult to close. Not what happened down there, but the fact that everyone at some point chose to look the other way and move on as if silence were enough to end a story. But silence, as the archives show, never ends anything.